Just like dogs, but they could have a more like a letter.
Still, that's just.
I was just telling you what to experience.
Now it's different. Yes, because the impression, the Italian. The question is just. But it's exactly the same. You just sort of raise the tones. Another nice thing about Greek is accents. So you know which word is this.
That's the one thing that I
Used to be two accents. But the word.
Yeah.
Made no difference.
Yes, but then I dropped it and I kind of read it.
We had to use them even though they were exactly the same. So what's make big companies and said, oh, let's get rid of one of the accents. We don't need to. One is done. Which is very logical.
Yeah. I think I'll have.
Yes.
Yeah, you can have no discipline enough. So, one minute. The music. Being able to, you know, the basic words, so I can love it. Yeah, any questions?
So you've been to the union, this is 10 years. Then in 5 years' time. Bigger.
It's Friday to Sunday, so it's Sunday. But I thought it was this week. Sometimes I said, okay. Ish.
Yes.
Yes, no, that was multiple. And then I share what is going on. Okay, and I say. They were. Not words. Deserve.
Oh, yes.
Thanks for this. I haven't.
When you are the
That it wasn't his, and you showed me in his work. I hope that I
Hello, welcome, bienvenidos. I am Víctor Ugarte, the director of the Instituto Cervantes. Welcome to our program today, Spanish Paintings at the National Gallery and the Wallace Collection, event organized by the UNED in collaboration with Instituto Cervantes. Let me first thank Esther Garcia, coordinator of the in London of the National University Distance Education, UNED, especially today for choosing us as a venue for this event. And of course, our speakers, Xavier Bray, Wallace Collections Director, Daniel Ralston, Associate Curator of the Spanish Paintings at the National Gallery, and Amaya Alzaga, Professor of Art History at the UNED, who will chair the roundtable at the end of the presentations. There will be a presentation of every speaker by Esther, for me. I will be very, very brief. I am sure most of you have visited both National Gallery and the Wallace Collection and admire the most famous Spanish works, such as Velázquez's The Toilet of Venus, or at the same, from the same author at the Wallace Collection, The Lady with the Fan. But I'm sure that after today's lectures, you will have the best excuse to visit these amazing art temples in London. Let me just briefly speak about our next events from the Instituto Cervantes, two of them only in the next weeks. We have the famous painter from Spain, Rafael Canogar, that he will be in London he's now in an exhibition in the Major Gallery, and he will come at least 90 years old. He's still very healthy and very, so he will have a talk and with him, we will have a talk with him in the 17th of July in this Major Gallery. And also we recommend we collaborate with the Cinema Rediscover Festival in Bristol on Thursday 24th, where we are premiering 2 restorations of Carlos Saura movies, Deprisa Deprisa and Los Ojos. And just as an art historian myself, I could not be happier than finish this welcome speech and to sit and listen, because there are many interesting things by the experts today to be here. So let me just give the floor to the main organizer today, to Esther Garcia, coordinator of the UNED here in London. Thank you very much. Gracias.
Good evening, everybody. It's a great pleasure to welcome you to this event organized by UNED University in collaboration, like Victor said, with Instituto Cervantes, dedicated to exploring the presence and significance of Spanish painting in 2 major galleries in London, the National Gallery and the Wallace Collection. We are especially grateful to Instituto Cervantes for their generous support, their continuous collaboration with UNED University in London, and for once again opening the doors to host one of our academic and cultural events. Their contribution is vital for promoting Spanish language and Spanish culture and Spanish art. I need to thank you, Amaya, because without her, we couldn't have this event. And thank you for her initiative and dedication. And it's not only the chair of the event, it's also the organizer. Amaya is an associate professor of art history in UNED University. Is also a curator, and she holds a PhD on the field. She's specialized in 17 and 19 Spanish painting, and she contributes significantly to this to the study of this period of painting. And we honored to have to be joined by two outstanding speakers. First of one is going to be Danielle Ralston, which is a curator of the National Gallery, where he focuses in Spanish and Italian Baroque painting. And she's a co-curator of a current exhibition in the National Gallery about Jose Maria Velasco, A View of Mexico, first UK show of the 19th century Mexican painter. And also after Danielle will be Xavier Bray, director of the Wallace collection, international respected specialist in Spanish art. Dr. Bray has curated major exhibitions about Goya and Murillo. He plays a leading role in expanding Spanish and visibility of Spanish painting. And I recommend an exhibition in the Wallace collection about Grayson Perry at the moment, which I went to visit, and I was impressed by the exhibition, and I really like it. And if somebody hasn't been, I recommend it. So thank you all of to join us, and I just they like to give the floor to Danielle Ralston, first speaker. Thank you very much.
Switch over screen. There we go. Well, thank you all for being here. Thank you, Amaya, for the invitation. Thanks to UNED for hosting, and also to the Cervantes and Victor in particular, and of course also to my colleague Xavier Bray. It's wonderful to share a panel. It's a special honor to present to all of you just in the moment after which the National Gallery has concluded its 200th birthday. Like anybody who turns 200, we've taken over a year to celebrate it. So that's lasted quite a long time, up until just about a month ago when we reopened the Sainsbury wing with a newly renovated foyer and welcome space, and for the first time in almost 35 years, represented the entire collection, given the opportunity of rehanging the Sainsbury. So in this evening's talk, I'll be looking at the history of the Spanish collection at the National Gallery. I'll touch on some major acquisitions, some of the exceptional loans that we have during our bicentenary year on view with us for the year until May 2026. And I'll also look back on the history of the collection. We are, of course, very fortunate, as you know, at the National Gallery to be led by Gabriel Pinaldi, the director, who has been responsible for the Spanish paintings at the gallery previously as a curator from 1992 to 2002, and as director since 2015. So he's had a major role in shaping the collection, as indeed has Xavier, who was an assistant curator in this part of the collection in the late 90s, and then also from 2002 to 2011. So I'm grateful to be one of the most recent, I hope, persons able to continue on this tradition. I want to first speak about the early history of the collection, just to situate us, before turning to more recent past, from the 1980s onward, looking at the gallery's acquisitions and our exhibitions of Spanish art, and finally to some recent research and conservation projects and our bicentenary redisplay. The collection of Spanish works at the gallery numbers 59. We have one solitary painting by a Portuguese artist. So far outnumbered by collections of Italian painting, about 1,000, and even by a Dutch one, about 500. So how is it that Spanish painting at the gallery has such an important place and occupies room 30, which is really at the very center of the building? It's indeed because the quality of that small collection is so exceptional, makes up really, I think, for that numerical disadvantage. We have 9 works by Velázquez, great master of the Spanish school in the 17th century, and he's only represented better at Prado. And the collection of Spanish painting at the National Gallery begins very, very early on, as you'd imagine from the works and the quality that they have. They begin indeed in the very foundational year of the museum's history. This is the first Spanish painting to enter the collection. I notice many of you are looking askance at this, as well you should, as well you should. This is one of 38 pictures that came into the collection from the collection of John Julius Angerstein, the banker whose works became sort of the foundation for the National Gallery. The title and attribution that are given here are those that were given in the Angerstein collection. As many of you have already seen, there's a small problem with this Spanish painting. If you recognize Philip IV when you see him, long face, big mustache, you recognize that this isn't quite him. This represents someone else entirely. And as is often the case when building a collection, there are some early errors. Those abound, especially in the early 19th century. Of course, this is not a picture by Velázquez. This is in fact by the Flemish artist Justus Sustemans. This error was corrected only in 1859 in a National Gallery catalog. So a good example of how little Velázquez's art was known in Britain in the early 19th century. The first true Spanish painting to enter the collection is this Boy by Murillo. It's presented to us in 1826, which is 2 years after the foundation of the gallery. And it's a charming genre painting of the kind that was really familiar to English audiences. He has sort of a mischievous grin. He's probably looking over potentially at this companion picture, which is in now a private collection. And it's typical of Murillo's paintings of young and then called beggar boys, and has sort of the loose handling of his late period. Works by Murillo were known in Britain as early as 1693, when a mention in the letter refers to one of Murillo's boys. And Murillo is indeed the painter that is best represented in the UK in the 18th and early 19th centuries. And some paintings by Murillo begin to appear in British collections from the 18th century. His self-portrait, also in our collection, was with the Prince of Wales by 1740. And another early arrival in this country, but not in our own collection, is the series of paintings by Zobra, 12 Tribes of Israel, which is held in Bishop Auckland at the Spanish Gallery. And those also came to Britain in the 18th century. And we owe, in many ways, our exceptional collection of Spanish paintings at the gallery, as do many institutions that are not in Spain, to two dramatic historic events, to the Peninsular War of 1808 to 1813, and the Desamortización of 1835 to 1837, the time in which the Spanish government suppressed monasteries and religious institutions, bringing out many of those works to the international market. And Murillo's were among those religious works that began to appear in the first decade of the National Gallery's existence. The picture on the left, the two Trinities, the Pedroso Murillo, was acquired in 1837. It got out of Spain by the British dealer William Buchanan in 1810, so during that period of upheaval. And then the infant St. John arrives at the gallery's collection in 1840. And that is representative of Murillo's international fame that had actually also been in a French collection in the 18th century. Both of these pictures, I think, give you a sense of why it was that Murillo was so esteemed by early 19th century British audiences. He's a very sweet painter who's able to sort of take these religious scenes and make them something that is relatable, something that is palatable, and something that would allow a relatively Protestant nation to acquire works by such a Catholic artist. Murillo's children, in particular, were a great focus of collecting in the UK. Any history of collecting should also include some failures and things that we've missed. And my industrious colleagues in the National Gallery's archive have recently cataloged the full run of offers that were made to the National Gallery of Spanish paintings throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries. And this absolutely monumental picture was indeed offered to the National Gallery in 1837 and then passed up for reasons that we're not totally clear on. I mean, one of those things being that it would be hard to imagine that fitting in our building. It was in a church in Paris at the time, and eventually, after several generations, ends up in the Louvre. So a wonderful work by Carrera de Miranda, quite unlike anything that we have in our collection. a couple of other offers that we turned down, again, for reasons that we don't quite know. The quality of both, I don't think, is as superb as we might hope. So maybe that was the reason that the trustees in the 1830s went against these. So the picture on the right, the flight into Egypt, is offered to the gallery in 1839 and ends up in Detroit by the late 1940s after we had turned it down. And the picture on the left, St. John the Baptist, was offered to the gallery in the 1850s. It had been acquired again during this period of upheaval from the convent of San Leandro, Seville. Eventually, it came to Fitzwilliam, Cambridge. And as we have seen with that picture that I began with, the picture by Eustace Sustemans, knowledge of Velázquez did drag behind. And the Tela Real, this picture I have on the screen here, Philip IV hunting a boar, was the first Velázquez to enter the collection. It comes to the gallery in 1846. And it also came out of this period of turmoil presented by Fernando VII, Ferdinand VII, the king who took power again after the Peninsular War, to a British diplomat who was the brother of the Duke of Wellington and eventually ends up in the National Gallery's collection. And it's a somewhat odd painting in Velázquez's œuvre in that he's not often a painter of landscape, but it's very characteristic the way that he reverses the most important and the sort of least important elements of the scene, in that the king on the horse in the middle of the trio of riders and the Conde Duque of Olivares, his valido, his main prime minister, are hunting the wild boar in very, very sort of minuscule kind of fashion. And the queen, Isabel de Borbon, you can just see in the carriage close by. So what should be by rights the most important part of the picture is very tiny. And what Velázquez spends his time doing is painting this really beautiful sort of genre scene along the front of the picture, which is carefully lavished a lot of attention on. So it's a typical sort of gesture of Velázquez, especially in his earlier periods, to switch the religious and secular narratives, and here he switches the regal and secular narrative. So only in 1853 is it that the gallery begins to acquire works that are not by Velázquez or Murillo. And both of the paintings here on the screen, one by Zurbarán and another, we think now, by an anonymous Neapolitan artist, were acquired at the sale of the French king, Louis Philippe, which was sold at Christie's in London in 1853. The Zurbarán picture on the left, St. Francis in meditation. We don't know anything about its original setting. Xavier has advanced the idea in his show Zickerman Real that it was probably intended for a particular sort of monastic cell, or there's some way of seeing it that would reflect the way the light falls in the picture, something that was used potentially for contemplation and prayer. And this painting, when it was acquired in 1853, caused a bit of a stir. There were some critics of the National Gallery's acquisition policies during this period, and they were complaining also in a slightly sort of anti-Catholic way that this painting by Zurbarán was a dark, black, repulsive picture. It should never have been bought for the national collection. They had no opposition, by contrast, to the picture on the right, which was claimed at the moment to be by Velázquez. And the price that was paid for it was about 10 times the picture on the left. But there were two scholars of Spanish art in Britain who played a large role in sort of popularizing the study of the art of Spain in this country, William Sterling Maxwell and Richard Ford, and they replied in the newspaper to this critic of the gallery's acquisition, saying that this is exemplary of Zurbarán's technical quality and his devotional feeling. And indeed, it remains one of the most iconic pictures by Zurbarán anywhere. The picture on the right, a bit more of a mystery. So if you have any ideas by the end of the lecture, I really do ask you to submit them, because every kind of name has been attached to this picture. There's been Spanish painters, Zurbarán has been suggested, Velázquez, that was bought by Murillo, Rivera, the Italian painter Massimo Stanzione, but nobody has really landed on anything. And I think that's one of the wonderful things about the National Gallery and any museum, is that there is the possibility of having something so good, and yet you have no idea who it's by. And which is actually the case of our recent acquisition at the gallery of a very lovely early Netherlandish picture, which is extraordinary as an image and work, but we have really little idea of who painted it. So it's nice to think that there are still mysteries to be solved. Velázquez's portrait, filled with fourth in brown and silver, came in 1882, was purchased at auction. His signature, painter's signature, appears in the petition that's held in the hand of the king. And it seems possible that this work was painted for a particular event, for the Pledge of Allegiance by the Cortes and other sort of parts of the aristocracy to his son, Baltasar Carlos. And Philip IV is recorded as wearing a costume of sort of special splendor, and this may be the instance in which Velázquez has recorded it. It's also preserved in superlative condition. It's unlined, and there's still evident in pasta. You can really still see the touch of Velázquez in the building up of the paint, especially the silver highlights in this costume, which would have been a more purpley color before the colors changed over time. And this is a curious one, another Velázquez that enters the collection. So I'm sort of moving chronologically down the line here. Enters our collection in 1890 as by Velázquez. It's also bought at the same time from the same collection as Hans Holbein's Ambassadors, so of exceptional quality and history, and another Italian Renaissance full-length portrait. So it comes from a very interesting source. And this painting, when it's bought in the 1890s, is really held up by the press as a great example of a work by Velázquez. Yes, there's a press account that writes, there is scarcely any language of praise which could be superlative enough. Calls it the very best Velázquez outside of Spain, and says it would be among the finest in that country. As you can see, of course, we now attribute it to Juan Bautista Martínez del Mazo, the son-in-law of Velázquez. But this is a bit of a tricky one, in that there are some competing claims about this picture. It has a false signature. We're uncertain in some ways of the date. So I think there's still some work to be done to figure out a bit more about this painting. One of the things that came up in my colleague's work in the archives, in addition to offers from the 1830s and 1840s, were offers from slightly later. And this is an image or two images of paintings that were offered at the National Gallery in 1892 by the Seville collector José Cañaveral, who has been a collector of note in Seville for several decades at this point. He writes in 1890 to offer two paintings from his collection, and he encloses these photographs, which we still actually have in our files. And if you're not an eminent scholar of Velázquez, you should know these are both, we think, paintings by Velázquez. And they were offered to the gallery in 1892 for a combined sum of £10,000. And the person who's writing the letter, not Cañaveral, but an associate of his, this man, Francisco del Riego Posada, offers them saying that, okay, you purchased recently Philip IV in brown and silver and the portrait of the Admiral, Julio Pareja, and he cites the prices. He says, I'm going to give you two for 10,000. What do you? And it's interesting, especially because this dossier isn't just selling something from a private collector. There's actually a letter of support from a number of very eminent figures in Spain, including Federico de Madrazo, Pedro de Madrazo, and Carlos Ribera, who are all painters, art historians, and administrators who I think are trying to support this purchase. And so had we decided to buy these in the 1890s, it really would have made for a exceptional collection of early works by Velázquez. As you can see from the captions on the right, we decided not to, so one is now in Berlin, and the other is in New York. Only in the 1880s do we begin at the gallery to collect things from before or after the 17th century. El Greco is a great example of this. His only begins to be recognized internationally in really the later 19th century. Up until that point, really since his death, his reputation has not extended far beyond Spain. And the first major painting by Greco that comes to the gallery comes from John Charles Robinson, who is involved at the V&A Museum of Prince Albert, first superintendent there, and it comes to the gallery in 1895. And unlike other things that had got out of Spain earlier, this had actually been bought by Robinson in London in 1877. So it wasn't something that had necessarily come directly from the dissolution of the monasteries or from the Peninsular War. And this painting, which is a subject that Greco paints on several occasions, shows him borrowing from Titian, from Michelangelo, but also sort of painting in his particular and odd style, sort of long attenuated figures and quite massive colors. El Greco didn't really enjoy a lot of popularity in Britain, in particular, during the late 19th to early 20th century. And so when the director of the gallery decided to acquire this work, which we now give to the studio of El Greco in 1919, it was also roundly criticized in the press. Strange colors, strange forms, and also the omnipresent idea that El Greco was a madman. So there was nothing worth redemption in his art. The critic Roger Fry at the time defended the acquisition of the painting by comparing it, I think, tellingly, in giving you some idea of what it was that El Greco represented to modern painters and modern art. He compares it to a painting by Cézanne, writing about its purposeful distortion and the way that he pulls at flames. It was a way of linking El Greco and the modern that really began even in the late 19th century. By 1900, the gallery has 5 paintings by Velázquez, which is already at that point the best collection outside the Prado. The addition of this picture of the Rugby Venus through public appeal and a work acquired through the National Art Collections Fund, the Art Fund, only added strength on strength. This painting is the only known surviving female nude by Velázquez, a very rare subject in 17th century Spain because of sort of inquisitorial regulation. But Velázquez, as a painter to the king, a painter of extraordinarily high status, was able to paint something like this for, indeed, the viewing solely of male aristocrats of a certain caste. And this painting, we don't know much really about who it was commissioned for or why. It's a bit mysterious, its early provenance. But it is a painting that has always really excited interest, no matter where it's hung. Throughout the 19th century, it hung in Yorkshire, in Rugby Hall or Rugby Hall, and that's from where it takes its name. The painting then is offered through Agnew's on the market in 1906 for an astronomical sum. And this is one of the first occasions on which the National Art Collections Fund is mustered to make up money and apply through public subscription, prevent a masterpiece from leaving Britain, so saving the painting for the nation, which is usually the phrase that's used. The final donation, it only recently was confirmed, came from the king, King Edward VII, who made a donation to acquire this for the National Gallery. The last paintings by Velázquez that we acquired were acquired in the mid-20th century. They're both from his early period. They're pair painted for the Carmelites in Seville when Velázquez is just sort of almost 20 years old. These leave Spain in the early 19th century and then are with an English collector for a long time. They're put on loan at the gallery in the 1940s and eventually acquired separately over time. The paintings really show the way that Velázquez, even at a young age, was really focused on the observation of everyday life and real people. So his St. John sort of has the look of kind of a rude, sort of brusque country boy, which is indeed what his biographers say that he used to sort of paint and draw from models. And on the left, the Immaculate Conception is an interesting representation, especially because one of our really exceptional loans for the bicentenary is another Immaculate Conception by Velázquez's studio mate, Alonso Cano, that we'll come on to in just a moment. But you get a sense, I think, when you see those works together, of the way that Velázquez is able to really capture with extraordinary naturalism. It almost seems to come from nowhere, the different kinds of sort of human features that are so much an element of Velázquez's paintings for religious institutions, but also in his portraits. And one portrait that did get away from this country is this astounding work, painting of Juan de Pareja, who is Velázquez's enslaved assistant. It comes from the same collection as had the portrait of Julio Pareja, the admiral, and also Holbein's ambassadors. It came on the market in the early 1970s, at which point it was sold for then a world record auction price of $5.5 million US, which now is $43.5 million. The director of the galleries was in England at that point, and because because of English cultural export laws, you're able to put a stop on something if it's going to leave the country and you deem it to be of certain importance. So a stop was put on this picture, and there was 3 months to try and raise the equivalent of $43.5 million. The National Gallery applied to the government for a special grant, but was unable to get the work. And so now the painting is in the Metropolitan Museum. The public outcry around this picture leaving in 1971 generated a lot of backlash. In that, when a Titian, the death of Actaeon, was about to leave this country, also the Getty Museum, another thing gone to the barbarian Americans, the British public wouldn't stand for it. And so in that case, there was a public appeal which led to that work being acquired for the collection of the National Gallery. So now I come to talking about sort of our exhibition program and things in the more recent past of the gallery. Exhibitions, as we know them now, were really few and far between, really until the 1970s and 80s. The idea of sort of a full-bore exhibition program was quite a modern one. And so you get a sense of just how minimal these exhibitions could have been in the past. We have the 2 pictures of Philip IV in our collection in brown and silver, and then the bust portrait there on the left. So temporary shows begin really in earnest at the gallery in the late 70s and 80s. There's a whole series of exhibitions that the gallery does on national schools. And so one of them, the 4th one in the series in 1981, which was curated by Alan Bram, who's also the author of the Spanish collection catalog, put together a show of 74 works of Spanish art, all from the gallery's collection, as well as private and public collections in Britain and Ireland. And it only is, as you can see, on for a month and a half. But apparently, according to our numbers, there were 500,000 visitors, which seems sort of hard to believe, but maybe possible. And as you can see, standards of display were somewhat different in the 1980s. A lot of carpet on the floor, and the furniture and some of the decorative objects were actually borrowed in from the V&A to give sort of some kind of period sense of the works. There's 20 paintings from the gallery's collection in the show. Alan Brown was the curator, writes the catalog of the show, which has a really useful, long introductory essay about the taste in Spain for the taste in Britain for Spanish painting, which actually is still a very useful source. And Enriqueta Jerez, who is one of the leading scholars of Spanish art in the UK in the late 20th century, says in her review of this show in the Burlington magazine that all of the painters that you'd expect to see, all the great painters of the Spanish school are represented, save Alonso Campo. During the 1980s, there's a concerted effort on the part of the gallery to buy more pictures that are not 17th century, but they don't fit into sort of what was called the golden age of Spanish painting. One of the priorities for acquisition was 18th century Spanish art, and especially in the run-up to a big exhibition that was done in 1989 on Spanish painting in the 18th century. So this view of the river Nerbeon in Bilbao, painted by Luis Paret, was acquired in 1983. It gives you an idea of why it was that Paret was called the Spanish Vato, a very sort of loose and light kind of painter. And it's part of a series of views that Paret makes of different seaports in the north of Spain. Another work of the 18th century, acquired also in the 80s and 86, is this gorgeous still life by Luis Melendez. Melendez was the leading Spanish still life painter of the 18th century. Spurned for royal commissions, he ends up spending most of his career making still lifes. And we're very fortunate to have this one, as well as another work that was acquired a bit later on. We also began to move backward in time as well as forward in the 18th century. And in 1995, this painting, probably the most important Spanish 15th century painting in Britain, was acquired for the gallery. It's by Bartolomé Bermejo. It comes from a little church of San Miguel near Tus in Valencia. It was the only painting that was remaining at that point. And now, quite interesting, that actually the whole valley that contains that church is now a reservoir. So it's all underwater. So the church that contained this work no longer really exists. It came out of the church in the late 1890s. A English dealer brought it to London, and it was acquired by a South African diamond magnate, Julius Werner. And it was held in his house called Luton Hoo, as well as his townhouse in London for many years after that point. And you can see, I think, why someone who had an interest in diamonds and jewelry would have had such an interest in this painting by Bermejo, which is so exquisitely detailed. Bermejo is an artist we don't know that much about. He was the subject of an exhibition at the gallery in 2019. But it seems clear that he has some training or understanding of Northern painting in the period. He signs his name on the little cartella down at the bottom left. And the man who donated the work is Anthony Joan, who's represented there, kneeling, looking up at St. Michael. You can also see just in the breastplate, the bottom of it, a bit of a reflection, which shows basically the heavenly city of Jerusalem, which is one of the things that is foretold in the book of Revelation, which is what this episode is drawn. And here it is actually in the house, in Bath House, London, where it appears on that wall in 1911. An interesting sort of group of things. You get a sense of just how varied Werner's collection was. And some of it is actually still on display in London at the Ranger's House in Greenwich. Sort of an odd group of things. Nothing of extraordinary quality, but a very interesting group of objects. There were continuing important exhibitions on Spanish subjects throughout the 1990s, especially this momentous show on still life, which was curated by two great experts on Spanish still life, William Jordan and Peter Cherry, along with, at this point, Gabriel Rinaldi, who was curator of that, bringing together in a way that had never really been seen before, still life from across sort of several centuries in the Spanish tradition. And as is often the case at the gallery, an exhibition can be the thing that precipitates an acquisition. And so the first Spanish still life that we acquire is this painting by Francisco de Zurbarán, which was in the exhibition in 1995 and acquired for the gallery in 1997. And this one, the first still life, it's interesting because many collectors that built the National Gallery in the 18th and 19th centuries, British collectors, didn't have a great focus on still life painting. And so our collection is actually quite small in comparison to that of other institutions of our size. So fitting this in has been an interesting part of working on the Spanish pictures of the gallery. And if you go now, you'll see that this work, along with another Spanish still life and the painting by Melendez that I showed you already, have been put together with a number of other still lifes from different schools to sort of show the best of them all together. And this work is particularly interesting for the history of the gallery because it was actually owned by one of our directors privately, Kenneth Clark, who's the great sort of director of the 1930s and 40s, who was best known really for appearing on television as the presenter for Civilization for the BBC, acquired this at some point in the 1930s. It was then bought by the gallery from his son, Clark. It might be, we're not totally sure, an independent composition or a fragment from a larger work. We're not entirely sure. And it's possible to read this with a cup of water and the rose, those symbols of the Virgin Mary. That's something that has to do necessarily with religious contemplation, but for some scholars, it's more sort of an exercise in observation. The contributions throughout this period of the National Gallery's sort of field-leading scientific and conservation departments have been important, especially in the study of Spanish paintings. There's articles in our technical bulletin on various aspects of Velázquez's production, as well as Mazo, son-in-law, and our collection catalogs, one of the great resources of the gallery, are still an important part of what we do for Spanish paintings. That said, the most recent one was a reprint in 1998 of a text from 1970, which borrowed a lot of text from 1952. So we're at a good moment, I think, to begin rethinking and redoing our Spanish catalog. That is indeed something that will start to happen in the next couple of years. Other big exhibitions for the past sort of 15 years or so, our blockbuster show on Velázquez, curated by Johnson Carr, catalog that is still an extraordinary reference today. The Sacred Maid Real, curated by Xavier, was really a revelatory way of thinking about the relationship between painting and sculpture in the 17th century in Spain, brought together works of sculpture and painting to think about the relationship and how it was that painters and sculptors collaborated and worked together. Another show curated by Xavier on the portraits by Goya, which brought together a great number of works by Goya, but just his portraits, which hadn't been an aspect that had been given as much attention as this show gave it. I haven't had time to touch on them, but the National Gallery does have 5 works by Goya, including our portrait of the Duke Wellington, as well as other works, including some small sketches for tapestries. In 2017, we acquired this work by Juan de Zurbarán, who was the son of Francisco. He only lives to the age of 29. He's a very, very rare painter. There's maybe 13 or 14 paintings known by him that are still with us today. And this work, I think, gives you a sense of how the gallery tries to build on strengths in its collection, moving from having the one small still life by Francisco to a very large and rare work by Juan. It also, I think, gets at one of the things that we don't discuss much in our collection, the way that Spain relates to the world in a broader sense, especially in the 17th century. If you look, the little cup, the porcelain bowl on the left is a piece of Chinese export porcelain, and it is actually identical, almost identical to one that was found in the wreckage of a galleon that sunk off Manila around 1600. So you get a sense of just how broadly spread Spain and its empire and its mercantile connections were in the 17th century. And that is something that I think we're trying to pull out more, especially in the last 10 years or so, in thinking about Spain as a global power in this period. In 2019, just before I arrived at the gallery, we had a staggeringly successful exhibition on Joaquin Sorolla, Spanish impressionist in a way, which certainly I think helped to move the tickets. And this show had 160,000 visitors, so a huge, huge success by any account. And it also introduced a really new facet of Spanish art to our public. Later 19th century Spanish painting, up until this point, not looked at in a great detail here in Britain. And it again led to an acquisition from a work that was in the show. This is The Drunkard in Tarauf, which is one of Sorolla's sort of harder, more social paintings where he's trying to deal with the problems of Spain in his time, rather than one of his more sort of typical sunny beach scenes, which we do have one of those on loan with us right now. So also well worth seeing if this is a little bit too depressing for you. And in the past couple of years, we've done, and I'd like to highlight a couple of research and conservation treatments. One related to this work in particular, which in 1952 had been given, after having been thought of as Murillo for a long, long time, was given to a French follower of Murillo, maybe having painted in the 18th century. And in the catalog, it says it has a French air about it. I don't know if I detect the French air necessarily, but with the help of Mara Collias, who was a conservation fellow, we embarked on a series of technical analyses and conservation treatments that allowed us to reattribute the work to Murillo quite convincingly, relationship to a particular drawing, as well as what happens when you remove some of those later additions that are removed. As you can see on the right, led us to publish the painting once again as by Murillo. Another recent conservation treatment carried out by Paul Ackroyd, one of our restorers at the gallery, one of our conservators, is this picture, which you may recognize from that one photo that I showed you of the Cleaned Pictures exhibition in 1947. Well, that was the last time it was cleaned. And so from 1947 to 2024, the painting and the varnish had just degraded. This happens over time. The varnish there becomes yellow and more opaque. And so Paul was able to do a relatively quick job in a way of removing this varnish, which really gives you the sense of what Philip IV looked like in this, probably the last portrait that Velázquez paints of him. Philip IV is known to have complained about how he looked older in every portrait by Velázquez, so concerns don't really change then and now. And even if this just removing the varnish doesn't change how old he is, he certainly looks much fresher. And now I come to some of the things that we have on view at the moment. We have some exceptional loans that are with us from the 10th of May of this year until the 10th of May next year, part of the celebration of our bicentenary. And for once, we do have a painting by Alonso Cano at the National Gallery. This is a new discovery. It was published by our colleague Benito Navarrete relatively recently in 2023. It was found in a French private collection. So an astounding representation by Cano of the Immaculate Conception with all the usual sort of symbols of the Virgin. And it's made for the altarpiece of a church in Seville, the Church of San Alberto. It appears obviously to be quite closely related to work by Velázquez, by his studio mate with his teacher, Francisco Pacheco. Pacheco has certain ideas about how you're supposed to represent the Immaculate Conception, and Cano has followed them very, very closely. It was my intention to hang these works alongside each other in our bicentenary redisplay to see how it is that Velázquez and Cano, who are almost the same age, they're working together in the shop of Pacheco, represent the Immaculate Conception in slightly different ways. But Gabriele, this director, I think, had the good point to make that the problem is when you put these two paintings beside each other, is that Velázquez just looks much better. So I think it's fine to have them on the same wall, but separated a bit. We also have from a private collection in this country on loan here this tremendous painting of the Sacrifice of Isaac by Juan de Wallace. An artist that's represented in our collection, but not in this kind of glory. And this work, one of the fine works of his mature style, really shows not only sort of his interest in a painter, in being sort of a painter of colors, but really the way that he's able to model the human form and the contrast between the almost sculptural marble-like armorial figure of Isaac and the angel is coming to stay his father's hand is a really interesting study in the way that Wallace was capable of painting these two different styles. And here you see it alongside the picture in our collection, the Immaculate Conception, of about the same date. And those are hung across a doorway from each other. So they give you the opportunity, I think, to compare the two. The final loan that's been brought in to sort of supplement our collection during this year makes a case for considering a bit more in a more thoroughgoing way the viceroyalty of Naples and Spain's relationship to southern Italy in the 17th century. Of course, most of southern Italy throughout the 17th century is part of the Spanish crown, and so Ribera, who paints for Spanish viceroys, is someone that we wanted to bring in, and we didn't have quite this kind of work in the collection. So this work of St. Jerome from this very sort of fertile period of his career is signed in the way that Ribera usually signs when he's trying to emphasize his Spanish identity. And just on the rolling paper there, he signs Giuseppe de Rivera Español. He signs and makes clear his Spanish nationality. And thinking about the relationship between Neapolitan painting and Spanish painting is something that, of course, we have done at the gallery, but we wanted to make it a bit more explicit. And so in room 30 at the moment, these paintings are hanging close by each other. The picture on the left is a relatively recent acquisition by the Neapolitan painter Bernardo Callarino, who is of a slightly younger vintage than Ribera, working in Naples and influenced certainly by the way that Ribera paints flesh. I think you can see that in the way as sort of light falls on the shoulder of St. Bartholomew, who's thinking ahead to the moment where, as is often depicted in Neapolitan paintings, very grisly, usually he's shown with his skin in the act of being removed. But Cavallino's gone for a much gentler path and just sort of shows a premonition of his martyrdom. So I think I'm able to say in this setting, in the last minute or two here, that all of this and all the work that we've done at the gallery over the past 200 years is, I think, something that brings attention to Spanish art in this country, but also beyond. And I'm happy to announce, and it'll come out officially soon, that we'll be doing a major exhibition on Zobra in spring 2026. So it will include our great St. Francis, as well as works that we've acquired in just the past 20 years. That show, and then along with our plans to revitalize the Spanish cataloging project, I think represent the gallery's commitment to Spanish painting, as well as its long history, which began, as we saw, 200 years ago with a painting by Wallace. Thank you.
So, thank you so much for inviting me, and thank you, Dan, for that fantastic introduction to the Spanish culture at Wallace, the National Gallery. I think it's very interesting, actually, and I have to commend the juxtaposition of the two collections, because they were born at the relatively similar times. Ours remained private, while the National Gallery was adding and buying things for the public. And therefore, what I'm going to give you a sort of introduction to really is how the Wallace collection, as well as collecting many other things, actually put together a rather wonderful nucleus of Spanish paintings, which, strangely enough, a bit like Apsley House, are not that well known. And as I was listening to Daniel, I was thinking, the good thing about the National Gallery, they've got a scientific department, they've got conservation, they've got big exhibition space, and I always have this sort of David and Goliath or this insecurity complex here. But the thing is that there are some wonderful things at the Wallace, and just even this detail. I don't know if we can dim the lights just to give a bit of atmosphere. Because the Spanish art loves a bit of tenebris. But this picture, I'll show you a bigger picture of it in a minute. But I just love the detail of this very beautiful Murillo, which unfortunately is hanging right up high in one of the galleries in the Great Gallery, and it's hard to appreciate its utter beauty. But very quickly, for those who have not been to the Wallace collection, which is in central London, Marylebone, just on the square, Manchester Square. I'm afraid this is private. Nobody's allowed to go in it. That's why there's never anybody on the lawn. But you can go into the house, which is on the other side of the street. And of course, when you walk in, you feel straight away that you've entered a London townhouse, and as if it hasn't changed. And of course, that's part of the charm. But we are a national museum. We opened to the public almost exactly 125 years ago, because on Thursday is our big anniversary when we first opened to the public here in London. But in the Great Gallery, which I just mentioned earlier, and this is where I get a bit closer to how the National Gallery looks, we have this amazing collection of one could say of masterpieces of European art. And this is where most of our Spanish pictures reside. The collection was put together by two intriguing characters, the fourth Marquis of Hertford on the far right, who never married, made money from properties and didn't really need to work that much. He just got a lot of rent back and was able to buy things at the highest quality. He was based in Paris at the most perfect time when many of the great Spanish collections were being sold in France in the 1840s. And Daniel mentioned the dissolution of the monasteries, but also great aristocratic collections such as the Altamira collection, the Guardia collection, the Salamanca collection, were all being sold in what was the art market of Europe at the time. And it was he who really acquired most of the Spanish paintings. And I'll tell you more about it. But he, to everybody's surprise, he left the collection to his illegitimate son, a man called Richard Wallace, whom he never officially recognized as his natural son, but confided in him the collection and the wealth. And Richard Wallace's big responsibility in 1870, when he inherited the collection, was to transfer the whole collection, which was in this corner apartment in Rue Lafitte, to London for safekeeping, because 1870 was the French communes, the Tuileries had burnt down, and Richard Wallace was extremely worried that his collection might get burnt down. So he brought it over to London and acquired the lease of Manchester Square, the Hertford House, and introduced a collection there where it resides today. But what's wonderful about the Wallace, just to give you an idea of the beauty of it, is the fact that it has this ability to show the cross arts, the idea of having furniture, porcelain, incense burners with paintings. And it is, has to be said, very strong in 18th century French paintings and decorative arts. We, of course, have the wonderful Swing by Fragonard and the Laughing Cavalier by Franz Hals, which is very famous, particularly amongst taxi drivers, because it is on the knowledge. If you're asked where does the Franz Hals reside, and you quickly say WC2N. Anyway, I don't know my postcode, which is terrible. That's the National Gallery, so it's still stuck around. Anyway, the extraordinary thing about the Wallace is that for a long time nobody knew what was going to happen to it. And it has to be said that Daniel and his team back in the 19th century were all very much expecting that the Wallace collection would one day be broken up, and that all the paintings, particularly the French paintings, would join the National Galleries, and of course the Spanish paintings. And so almost I could easily say that I would not be here, and Daniel would have spoken all about the National Gallery pictures, but the Wallace also bequest to the National Gallery. But luckily, that didn't happen, because Lady Wallace, Richard Wallace's wife, who survived him by 7 years, decided that the collection should be given to the nation, but should remain intact, should be kept together and not split up. And it's true, it could have easily happened. Pictures could have gone to the National Gallery, the beautiful Sèvres could have gone to the V&A, and our wonderful armor could have gone to the BM, and that would have been it. But luckily that was not done. Now, going back to the fourth Marquess, he had very specific kind of taste. And I would say that the National Gallery was a bit freer in terms of what they could acquire. And Daniel referred to I think, possibly the greatest masterpiece by Surbrand of this monk, this figure, this captured monk is, of course, posing St. Francis in prayer, this black, repulsive thing. That was probably what the fourth Marquess also thought. It is black and repulsive, and it's not what I want for my collection. So when I first joined the Wallace collection, a lot of people said, you're mad to be going there. There are no martyrdoms at the Wallace collection. And it's true. There are no Riberas where blood is gushing and skin is being removed. And the only painting that is of any kind of violence is a Rubens crucifixion. And indeed, Marquess of Hartford liked pleasing pictures. He did not like anything that would hurt one's innermost feelings, which means that Murillo was the perfect painter for him. And indeed, he'd been collected very much. It was, the French loved him, particularly 19th century, but the British had a real taste for Murillo from the 18th century onwards. And indeed, a collection that we should also possibly be discussing today is the Dulwich Picture Gallery, which has the most wonderful nucleus of Spanish paintings. But Deux-Enfants, the founder of the gallery, indeed in his diary, said, Murillo, the favorite of all our collectors. And there's the wonderful self-portrait that is at the National Gallery. But this meant that the fourth Marquess, when he went for his sort of acquisitions at sales, both Christie's here in London and Paris, bought a whole array of Murillos of different quality. And as you can see, unlike the National Gallery pictures, there are still some that are dying to be conserved, such as this wonderful Murillo that is meant to be a copy, but I like to think it might be a lost original. Who's that man that does the discoveries? Fatal Fortune. What's his name again? I always forget. Moldy. Anthony Moldy. Sorry. Anyway, that's the kind of picture that you could bring out. But going back to the picture that we saw earlier, this is the perfect image of the Virgin child, the child that's so naturalistically painted, almost as if he's looking at us and wants to play with us. She's holding the rosary. I showed you that beautiful detail there. It's always wonderful to sort of see these pictures in detail. And another picture that we have in the collection, which is also hanging high, is this tondo, this sort of fictive stone-like niche. And it is interesting to see how Ruskin took on that taste for the beautiful Virgin, the idea of a real lady, women posing for him, and how it touches on the Raphael and Correggio, and how it was a way of almost trying to convince collectors that Spanish painting was worth collecting because it had an Italian quality. And you have to remember, National Gallery was very forward-thinking, really, to be buying paintings by Spanish masters at the time. Italian painting was very dominant. Raphael's was what you were acquiring. So this was a way into that Italian state, but with a Spanish artist. I think Daniel mentioned the dissolution of the monasteries. He mentioned the Peninsular War. And indeed, Maréchal Soult was one of the great protagonists of somebody who plundered Spanish monasteries and churches. And he had the most extraordinary collection of Spanish art, which one day would be wonderful to reconstruct it. We have a sale catalogue of 1852, and even the Gazette des Beaux-Arts sort of came up with a whole sort of mini catalogue of all the best pictures, including this Murillo down there and another Murillo above, the famous Soult, Immaculate Conception. It was acquired by the Louvre actually for an extraordinarily high price. Unfortunately, I haven't done what Daniel did, was be able to convert it into pounds, but let's say it's 4.4 million pounds. But it was definitely the most expensive picture sold at the time. And one of the paintings at the Wallace that has a Soult provenance is this rather, I mean, it's not a very good photograph, but a rather nice picture of the Virgin Child with Joseph in the background with St. John the Baptist. Was wonderful. And again, Daniel touched on this, is the provenance of these pictures, where they came from. And this, again, it's not such a great picture, but you can see how beautifully painted it is. But it came from the Sagrado chapel in Seville. And I wonder if it was one of those pictures that was up high, hanging like you see those pictures there now. But it was taken by Soult, and he had a very good eye. He always went for the very best paintings by Murillos. But we do have other Murillos, particularly these three paintings here that were very interestingly acquired from a provenance point of view by a Genoese merchant called Violato. He was living in Seville. He wanted to buy these pictures of Virgin Child, Nativity, Joseph being thrown into the well, and then St. Villanueva giving money to the poor. They ended up in Genoa in a Capuchin monastery, and eventually Buchanan bought them and they made their way to England. But again, because they're part of the big hang, they're quite hard to appreciate. Daniel's very lucky to have his own Spanish gallery, and then you can really focus on them. But this Murillo is competing with many other pictures, and it's lectures like this that allow you to really focus on to the picture and how beautifully composed it is, with the Virgin in the middle, shepherds crowding round, and one shepherd pushing down a sheep that's been tied up. This wonderful sort of still life effect of the hat and the bag on the left, and then the ox looking at you in the eyes. And then the intimacy is quite wonderful, the way the Virgin looks down at her son with great pleasure. But the son, and this is only the other day, I realized there's a lot of interesting dynamics going on in the picture. The son is actually, Jesus is actually just noticed above a detail that I could not see until I was doing some filming, and the camera revealed angels, but angels showing the poor little Christ child the cross, and basically telling him, life's going to be short for you, you will soon be crucified. So the young Christ child already taking into account his future crucifixion. And I guess it's touched on by the sacrifice of Christ in that wonderful painterly quality of the lamb that is being held down by the shepherd. The other picture, which verges on the kind of paintings you get in Dutch picture galleries, sort of urchin, poor people in terms of figures, is this scene of St. Thomas of Villanueva giving alms to the poor. And you've got the poor beggar who's suffering from all kinds of skin disease, particularly in the scalp, with then this beautiful sort of Vestal Virgin-like figure, quite classical, holding her child, and the child has just shown the coin he's been given. But when you zoom into the details, wonderful details of dirty feet that Ruskin despised, and this is when he did not like Murillo because of the realism that he introduced into his pictures. But there is one particular picture that the fourth Marquess hesitated to acquire, and he had an agent called Samuel Mawson, and in his diary he says, that I only like pleasing pictures, and the subject of the one in question may not be quite to my taste, which is this one, Joseph, who's been thrown down the well. And I guess it's that the violent connection, or the violent thematics that upset the fourth Marquess's delicate taste. I don't know what it is. Maybe he had a bad childhood accident and fell into a well or something like that. It's surprising that he would not go for it. But it is quite a rare Murillo in terms of the theatrical quality in this picture, and the emotion of this young boy being held up and about to be thrown in. But perhaps my ultimate favorite Murillo, and I think Murillo that the National Gallery would love to have this as well. This would be like it's a small picture. It's tiny. It's on mahogany. I'll show you the back of it. And it's very special because it's very jewel-like. And what's astonishing about it is that it was in the Spanish Royal Collection until about 1778. For some reason, it must have been sold or given. Something again, unlike National Gallery, one hasn't had time to do proper research on the provenance, but it would be a wonderful project to do. But it does leave Spain early on in the by the end of the 18th, early 19th century. But when you see it close by, it is astonishing. This beautiful moment between the matrimony of the young virgin and Joseph. The men are on one side, a lot of men who failed to get her hand because their baton did not flower, but you can see Joseph's baton is flowered. You can see them there at the back, a bit frustrated, and one of them is breaking the baton in anger. And then that's the back of the panel, this beautiful mahogany. Mahogany presumably coming from the Indies. Maybe Daniel knows where mahogany came from, but maybe it's Cuba. I don't know, but it was definitely imported from the Americas. And then this beautiful image of the Virgin with the lovely ultramarine blue. Somebody whoever commissioned this was very excited by, wanted to pay a big price because the pigments used are of the top quality. And one of my favorite parts is this lost profile of this beautiful attendant to the Virgin with the lovely ribbon in her back. The dating of this picture is not known. It's about probably 1660, but I like to think that Murillo had gone to Madrid and possibly looked at Velázquez. This is where Murillo and Velázquez meet stylistically. Of course, he was too young to have met him directly. But I'm thinking of those beautiful, very relatively unknown, well, not often spoken about Velázquez portraits of the Sibyl here, side profile. But then my absolute favorite one from the Meadows Museum, just the way it's painted, that sort of stylistic looseness in approach. But the painting that is of great interest and deserves to be X-rayed and infrareded, and it's never been looked at before, is this other small picture that we have in the gallery, which is very likely a sketch. Sketches by Murillo are not that common. I mean, there are a good 10 to 15 sketches, but this is quite a rare survival. He's a great draftsman and many drawings survive, but not so much sketches. And having done a bit of research, I suspect this was one of his first ideas for a very large altarpiece that he was commissioned by the Capuchin convent just inside the walls of Seville. You can see this wonderful early drawing of the walls of Seville, and then the Capuchin monastery on the far left. So it was quite a desolate place, slightly out of the city centre. And in the main church, I think it was likely that this was going to be the big altarpiece, because it's got St. Francis on the bottom left. It's got the two Sevillian saints, Santa Justa and Santa Rufina in the bottom, and then St. John the Baptist, looking all up to the Virgin. There is a lovely drawing that shows you how he was really sort of working out these sort of this sort of group of saints down beneath, particularly the two female saints down beneath. And actually, when you zoom in, you could see how close that was. But what's fascinating is even with the naked eye, you can see that in between the two ladies, Santa Justa and Rufina, is what appears to be the Giralda. Can you see that? I mean, sometimes I see it, sometimes I think I could say today, I'm a bit tired. But the Giralda, being, of course, the great Moorish tower that was turned into a bell tower, is in between the two. And that's because the miracle goes that it was about to collapse. There was a big lightning, I think, and suddenly Santa Justa and Rufina flew out and held on to the bell tower and saved it. And that's why Murillo had intended to have it there. What's interesting is that in the end, and this is again supposition, but it sounds as if the Capuchin said, look, this is great, your sketch is very interesting, but actually we'd like you to individualize the saints and have pictures of them on their own. And indeed, the big altarpiece becomes lots of small altarpieces for side chapels. And here is his ultimate solution for the two lady saints. Two saints who are well known because they were martyred because they refused, their father was a potter, and they refused to use the vessels to worship Roman gods. So they were martyred for that reason. But that's why you've got this beautiful still life. The same thing went forward with the St. John the Baptist that you see in the sketch on the left. It turned into a picture in itself, which is interesting. And then this is again, if you've got good X-ray vision, next to St. Joseph, you can see that there is what looks like a figure of a man wearing a mitre. And you can just see it there. See that? And in the end, Maria decides to turn it into this painting of San Leandro and another saint who's St. Bonaventura, I think, who is posing there. And this time the mitre has been taken off. So interesting to see these early ideas. The Museum of Seville actually tried to reconstruct this whole altarpiece in this way here. So you can see how it would have looked. So that was a sort of photographic reconstruction. And then they managed to borrow pictures that had been taken out of Spain, particularly the main altarpiece, which is now in Cologne, which I wonder if it was offered to National Gallery at one point, but it's not one of those other large pictures. But it's interesting to see what happened to Murillo's sketch, Wallace sketch, and how it gets turned into this large picture. And it's interesting that the top part he sort of keeps, but introduces Christ with the crucifix rather than just having the Virgin. Anyway, it's quite interesting to see a sketch being and how he involved with his artistic ideas. The other painter that we have that represents the artist well is Velasquez, not as well as the National Gallery, but we do have this very enchanting Baltasar Carlos at a young age of about 4 years old. Velasquez had been in Rome in 1629-30 and got a text message from the king saying, look, you need to come back because my son has just been born, you need to portray him. So this is one of the early series of portraits of the young prince being depicted by Velasquez. And quite remarkably, Velasquez sees him grow up and paints him as he grows. Unfortunately, the prince dies at a young age, but wonderful portrait of a young child holding his baton of command. Interestingly, it was in the Altamira collection where there were quite a few Goya portraits of children, and I sometimes wonder if Goya knew this picture. But the Little Red Boy, for example, in the Metropolitan is possibly inspired by this. But when you get close up, it's just wonderful to get the ruffled hair, the eyes looking out. He's wonderful at capturing that sense of childhood, but also the little gorget around his neck. And we have quite a few of those in our armory at the Wallace. And then the hilt of the sword and the way it's been painted. Unfortunately, it's very it's been restored in such a way that it's been flattened, but you still get a wonderful touch that looks a bit like Daniel's painting of Philip IV, which is unlike ours, is very line. So, but you still see how it might have looked with these beautiful touches of white. One day, it'd be wonderful. This is a plan we have, is to reunite our little Don Baltasar with a slightly earlier portrait of the prince with his dwarf. And it's just fascinating to see him grow up already within a year or two, but still using that same pose. And what I love about the Boston painting, which is from the Museum of Fine Arts of Boston, is how the dwarf is almost looking back at the portrait and trying to mimic the prince, and yet the dwarf is within the picture. So it's typical Velasquez. He's playing with space. Is the dwarf in front of the painting, or is he in the painting posing with the prince? And there's that double sort of entente that makes the picture so intriguing. But also at the Wallace, we have a painting we restored recently, and we cleaned it, and it's come out rather well, which is Don, the prince, having a riding lesson. He is in front of his apartment of the Buen Retiro Palace. He's doing a levade, looking rather confident with himself, looking at you in the eyes. In the background, you can see people are assisting him. One of the court dwarves is holding a lance. And indeed, I have to admit, this is the nice thing about working in the Wallace, is that you, from your curators, you learn all about furniture, about porcelain, but you learn about armor and about jousting. And what this is on the right is actually a tilting yard. So this horse would be running down this direction, and another one would be coming the other way. And you'd have either a practice, but you also had this game where you tilt and try and get a ring. And that was a practice. And it is very likely that this dwarf and this man here are assisting the young prince to basically teach him how to joust. And he has a very sketchy detail of what's going on in the tilting yard. And I don't know if I got detail. And then here's one of his dwarfs, possibly El Primo, who was, we know, one of the court dwarves linked to Balthazar Carlos. If you look back, this is my theory, and maybe you can help me out. But there is a very strange contraption here at the back. I think that these are big, large wheels, and what looks maybe like a seat. And I like to think that actually Balthazar Carlos wasn't, old enough to joust on a horse, and therefore he might have been put onto this strange contraption and would have been pushed along and pretending to tilt. But I don't know. I still haven't found any survivor of such contraptions. The extraordinary thing is that in the private collection here in Britain is another version of this picture, a version that we all agree is superior to the Wallace collection, mainly because it's in better condition. It feels as if Velázquez's hand is very, very present, although the one at the Wallace has got some great qualities, but it might have some studio collaboration in it. But the one that's in private collection is important because it shows it has a different sort of story, narrative. Although the prince is still doing his levad and nothing much has changed, what you do get is one of the court officials here presenting the lance to Olivares, the minister of the king, the first minister, and it is he who's going to hand it over to Balthazar Carlos. And the big question is, why are there two versions? Are they separate to each other? Are they conceived for different settings? It's a big sort of mystery. And is ours a sketch for the one that's in the private collection, or are they just a separate picture? What is interesting is that we have the background. We know exactly where Balthazar Carlos is. He's on the extreme side of the Buen Retiro Palace. So the Prado is now here. This is Los Jerónimos, and this is the Retiro Park today. But this little corner here is where the action is happening. If you zoom in, you can see a bit more. But that is basically where Balthazar Carlos had his apartments, and the tilting yard or the sort of makeshift tilting yard was just on the other side. If you don't believe me, here's a ground plan. I don't quite into this. It's like detective work, but basically, here we just see it from there. The tilting yard is around here, or where he was practicing. But what's really interesting about this plan is that there is what you can see, number 7, in the question portrait of no less than Philip IV. And so here we are. I mean, this is amazing. This exists. Right? But here is Philip IV on his horseback doing a levad. Famous sculpture by Taka, and then that's the apartments of Don Balthazar Carlos, and the viewpoint that Velázquez is using is from here, in that direction. So the makeshift tilting yard would have been in this area, and I just love the idea that and here it is today in the Plaza de Oriente, the same very sculpture just outside the Royal Palace. But I just love the idea of Balthazar Carlos doing his levad and totally aware that there is a sculpture of Papa doing the same thing. And say, look, Dad, look what I can do, sort of thing. And it's the kind of thing that Velázquez would have been very in tune with. So anyway, that's that story. But the other picture that really I didn't mention in the introduction is this wonderful portrait of the lady with the fan. We still do not really know who she is, although there have been lots of theories. She is stunning in the way when you approach her, she looks as if she's looking at you in the eyes. There's a sort of wetness around her eyes, as if she's just blinked and then looks out again. The naturalism is astonishing. She seems slightly nervous as you look at her because she realizes that her cleavage is slightly swaying, so she's pulling across her veil. She's just been fluttering. It's been a hot day, so she's fluttering her fan. And then in the lower left-hand corner is this astonishing still life of what appears to be a rosary with this beautiful blue ribbon. And then what I think is a piece of coral And then another sort of strange shape. People have said it might be a clock, a little watch. But actually, I think, and this is proposing here, that it might be something known as a pelican in piety. These were jewels that were very popular with women in Spain. They would be at the end of a rosary, and they showed a pelican eating its own flesh to feed its small little birds here. And they were extraordinarily popular, and I wonder if that shape at the bottom are the wings, and that might be to do with the coral, might be the blood of Christ. I don't know. It's a very strange shape, and yet very difficult to tell what it is. Unfortunately, the identity of Our Lady is unknown, and it was proposed by Zaire. I believe that it might be the Duchesse de Chevreuse, a French lady, and there are all kinds of portraits of her, and it's rather hard to tell which one is the most realistic. I've gone for this print because prints, I like to think, never lie. Once they're done, they're done. But she was fleeing the French court, apparently an incredibly fashionable lady. She is documented to have been portrayed by Velasquez, but in terms of knowing whether this is the portrait, it's extremely difficult. And I just reversed the picture just to give it, to sort of show you that it looks like you can decide whether it's the same woman or not. I don't think it is. And I like to think she is. But a wonderful portrait of the court, but maybe not a lady directly linked to the court, to the extent that some people used to think it was Velasquez's wife, but she's not. The mystery definitely carries on because in Chatsworth, there is another portrait of, I'm sure, the same woman.
Yes.
And it is astonishing when you compare the two. So there's a bit of dancing going on. You can see her, this time she is much more soberly dressed, her cleavage is covered. It's a picture that's been, again, demoted to Mather, but it's of astounding quality, and I wouldn't be surprised if one cleaned it, that it could be put back to the sort of Velasquez authorship. But an interesting experiment to be done at one point. And last but not least, talking about beautiful ladies, I thought I should end with who is presiding at the Wallace. The big question is, what would happen if Grace Berry went to Spain and did an exhibition? I just don't know how the Spanish would react to it. He's not the most exportable of our artists. He's very popular in Poland, in Sweden, and in Norway, but pretty much nowhere else. So maybe, yeah, I mean, I'm sure Grace would be very delighted, but maybe this is his moment to slowly enter the Spanish artistic diaspora. But thank you very much for listening.
So do you hear me? Well, it's been an honor for me to organize or think or whatever from la Universidad Nacional de Educación a Distancia, which has the university here also in London, and to think about painting and to think about two collections, because I teach art history in Madrid at the UNED in Madrid. So I thought when I came here in February that we could do something else, and that we keep on talking about the Prado collections, but we need to rethink and collaborate with all the Spanish paintings that have for centuries and been abroad. It's a long debate. We don't want to have here that if it's okay for some paintings to be outside or not. That is not the point of this course. And I personally believe in all the cases we've been talking about and listening to Daniel y Javier, permitidme llamaros así, that it has been so great for art history because we kind of always think about the other side of the coin. This shouldn't be here, and sometimes when I travel to London or the Metropolitan, and you always hear some Spanish people in front of the Goyas and the Velázquez, all these told this, or this should be in Spain. Well, this is not the case. They perfectly, both of them explained why are these paintings here. And we need to see the other side of the coin because these paintings have formed the eyes of other paintings for generations. We wouldn't have Manet without La Galerie Espagnole de Louis-Philippe, and we wouldn't have so many painters without, and we wouldn't have had the marvelous Hispanistas that Spanish art has had, because when you do your own art history, your view is not always clean, and sometimes you need someone to step outside the forest and explain you the forest. And that has been the case of Los Hispanistas Británicos, which we owe a lot, and we thank, and that have been marvelously represented today with Javier Bray and Daniel Branston. And we thought, I thought of doing this course for all these reasons, but also because as Javier has perfectly noticed it, there were two collections very interesting to compare, because it's not the same to do the National Gallery collection with all these, depending, I guess, on the age, on the time, but big founds and public founds. And it is not the same to have the pleasure to visit the Wallace collection. I want to confirm, Javier, that we all are here for the Wallace collection. So don't feel bad.
I was like, it's a good trick to play, but don't worry.
Well, we don't know where the other national thing is, so we all came for the Wallace collection. And I wanted to ask you as the first question, which collection de collection would you compare the Wallace collection you direct, the I don't know, the Jacques Marandré, Lázaro Galdeano, Frick collection? What is to you as an expert, and after all these years directing, which is the brother or the sister of your Wallace collection?
It's a good question, and I, in order to be provocative, I'll say none of those.
Yeah.
The thing is, Mr. Frick did come to the Wallace and said, I want to do the same thing back home, and to a certain extent he achieved it, but with not so many amazing works. I mean, he does have a Vermeer, he does have one of very good of each, but in terms of the sheer size and scope and diversity of the collection, it's unequaled. And this is something that I'm trying to explain to people, is that when Lady Wallace gave the collection to the nation, she actually said, the house, you're not having the house, you will build me a special museum in central London. And the big idea was actually to go right next door to Daniel's institution, the National Gallery, where the Sainsbury wing is now. They were going to build the Wallace collection there with a bridge, so that the collection be kept together, but accessible, so that if Daniel wanted to compare his Philip IV with my painting, he could do that, but it would have meant that we could not have hung together. So that would have been the annoying thing. In the end, the government, being the government, decided to just buy back the house and do a bit of cleaning out and then bring it back as a museum, which is fine. And it means it's very atmospheric and it makes you think of the Frick, of the Jacques Marandré. But we are truly a national museum. We became public, we're free, which means that we are supposed to be institutionalized, but because of the house, it always feels very atmospheric. The museum that I like to compare ourselves with, and I think got it right to a certain extent, is the Gulbenkian Museum in Lisbon, which is a modern museum that holds this beautiful private collection and is displayed in the most astonishing way that is both intimate and yet well designed. And I'm not saying that's where I wish I could put the Wallace collection, but that's where I think the Wallace collection could really shine because it has Islamic pieces, it's got furniture, it's a similar collection and of a similar quality. So that would be my answer to that.
Well, it's a wonderful answer. I didn't know. I learned a lot today. Thank you from you both. That the Wallace collection was at the Rue Lafitte. I didn't know that. I never
I
thought
mean,
of
it was
that.
private. It was,
Yeah, of course,
it
of
was their
course.
home, and it was most of it was in storage because they couldn't fit it anywhere. So it was a lot of it in storage. So that's where it was. And then another part was in Bagatelle, just outside West Boulogne, which still exists, but with no collection there anymore.
And I also wanted to ask you both that I have here my privilege. You, the British Hispanistas, have gave us the forest from the outside. And today I was looking at your both wonderful collections, and I was thinking as a Spanish eye, how they really like the silver Velázquez. To me, you have as a Fricas the silver Velázquez, which is not that much our Velázquez. You have really a very special both. Velázquez, and Velázquez slide Manet, Velázquez slide Courbet, every 19th century Velázquez, and you both have the the Flemish Velázquez from the Prince, even La Tela Real, the backstory comes, and also in the Lección de Equitación, from the backstory coming to the first place. So how do you think, whomever wants to answer, that the Velázquez that have been bought have created the British Velázquez?
I mean, I think it's a fair point in some ways because, I mean, of course, the best place to see Velázquez is in Madrid at the Prado, of course. But I mean, Velázquez was for his entire career painter to the king, so there were things that were just never going to come on the market. And so I think at the Prado, then you see sort of all the different manners that Velázquez has. But I think maybe there's something to what you're saying about the idea that the kinds of works that were able to be exported weren't necessarily ones that always had a royal collection provenance, even though, I mean, brown and silver comes from the Escorial, but the kind of interest that modern artists have in Velázquez, I think you're right in saying, is really shaped by the knowledge most of their paintings that are not in Spain. And it's only in maybe the 1870s, 80s, through 90s, when more foreign travelers begin to go to Madrid, that you begin to have a much different idea of what Velázquez really is. And I think the idea that that painting by Eustace Sustemans could have been considered by Velázquez, I mean, gives you an idea that nobody had any idea what Velázquez was supposed to look like, certainly in the 1820s. So I think it is interesting the way that a certain idea can be fostered, especially because in public museums, you know, there is that opportunity. I think that's one of the great strengths of the National Gallery, that because it has been open and free to the public for so long, those images are sort of seen and reproduced often, so they can sort of create maybe a somewhat skewed narrative of what Velázquez is supposed to look like. I don't know if you have anything.
No, I mean, with Manet, it's very interesting that he wasn't, before he went to Madrid, he was looking at what was in the Louvre, and they weren't, and they're now not considered to be by Velázquez. They were very impressive. One was the Infanta Margarita by his studio, but for him was the ultimate Velázquez. And the other one was a small detail of men talking, a bit like the Tela Real. And he made, you know, copies after it and worshipped the picture because it was a sort of a taste of a sort of impression of what real. And then, of course, when he goes to the Prado, he's on his knees. So there is definitely the approach. I would say the temple is the Prado, and then what's in this country in France, with, you know, close imitation. Having said that, the National Gallery has got Velázquez's, the Louvre does not have, and it is very, very special that the National Gallery should have so many great pieces.
Definitely the second best.
Yeah.
Collection, definitely, no doubt, no discussion about that. Of course. But it's curious that you say that because you also have a parallelism with the French in the San Francisco, the Zurbarán. There was the same scandal, same discussion in 19th century before you. I think it was in France. I'm sorry, I didn't check, but before you, I think I'm almost sure. When they bought this huge San Francisco on the feet like that, which is more scary than yours. The press, I think it was 1839. There was a big debate that we don't want that. That is scary. So it's very interesting that all the parallelism you have with the French taste, and that the Velázquez you've created, and I of course understand you cannot make a big collection about Velázquez because they're not out of the entourage of Philip IV. So of course, but what about the Zurbarán that you've created? What do you think, both of you, that is? And of course, Murillo.
Well, I think, I mean, in the case of Zurbarán, it's true that when that picture is on view in the Gala Español, or St. Francis, the kneeling St. Francis, I mean, it's the star attraction in a way, right? It is the picture that all of these writers talk about, that Gautier talks about, that Manet seems to base his monk and prayer on. There was a really wonderful exhibition in Bremen a couple of years ago done by Dorothy Hansen that really dealt with this Manet and Spain connection with exactly Astruc, one of his associates. So you get a sense of the way that he picks up certain ideas from Zobra. But it's true that it is a partial vision, especially because in the Gala Español, there's maybe 80 paintings that are attributed to Zobran, and how many of those stand up now? Maybe 5 to 10, if that. So I think there is an interesting way in which sort of the idea of adopting a tradition, adopting a national style that is not your own, that you're encountering in an odd kind of way and filtering and then making it into something new. I mean, it's a story of all art history, and it's the same in the 19th century with Japanese prints. There are things that are of very low value that are then interpreted by by French artists in particular as being something of incredible aesthetic wonder. And then the way that's filtered then into French painting gives rise to sort of a new kind of art. And I think that sort of productive misunderstanding is a useful thing once in a while.
So we owe to Javier Bray, all the Spanish art historians, that he was one of the ones who showed us to watch the forest from outside with his marvelous and always remembered the sacred made real. We owe him to revisit the portraits of Goya. So in which manner do you think that it was important that you had an outside vision, or that it didn't matter at all for you?
And that's a good question. It's crucial to not be Spanish when you do such exhibitions, because it's the way you grow up. If you grew up in Spain, you grew up with Holy Week, Semana Santa. You see these images being venerated, and the artistic is there, but it's a different kind of artistic emotion. It's a religious one, and I think, I mean, I was lucky to study anthropology as well as art history. So I've always been interested in human behavior and worship and iconography and all that kind of thing. So for me, when I went there, I was observing, and I think, of course, I like to partake and do all kinds of things as part of as a way of trying to understand it and having empathy. But it meant that I could then take a step back here in London. But it was very interesting when we were designing the exhibition, especially for the sake of the made real. are we going to make it church-like? Some lenders said, look, we'll lend your sculpture. Normally it's here in our church and it's been venerated, but we'd like you to light a candle next to it or put a flower. And, you know, great idea, but little by little, we retracted that. And in the end, it was just the way we lit them and let them be. And although they could be seen as great artistic objects, because of their nature, they still retain their religious spirituality, but without the sort of Catholic context from which they were always in, which meant that ultimately they were accessible to all kinds of religion. And we had a lot of interesting connections that were made with, you know, Islam, Sufism, with all kinds of things, and that made it all the more interesting. And I think that could have only happened really by taking it out temporarily before sending it back. And Valladolid did try and redo the show, and I did a very good job. And I was lucky to advise them, but it didn't have the same impact, let's say, as it did in London.
I visited both.
Oh, did you?
Yes, and it's very interesting to see your outside view that I saw today again, because you have to, I don't know how you say that in English, lidiar. You have to deal. You have to deal not only with you do of course have at the Wallace masterpieces, no discussion masterpieces, Franz Holz, Fragonard, etc., but in the minor pieces or in some of the Spanish paintings that you kept on comparing to the ones from the National Gallery, that it's not that good, but or this is very good because you need to force your eye and also try to understand why they bought that. Because working from, it is not the same that for you to keep on studying works that Kenneth Clark, marvelous, remember, Kenneth Clark bought, than to you that when the people who bought are always the same. And you keep on studying what decided two eyes 100 years ago. So it is applaudable the way you kept on working on every piece to try to discover the jewel, and of course the La Duchesse de Chevreuse that nobody I think no more than is the Duchesse de Chevreuse, because the nose is completely different, but the one in Chatsworth of course needs a cleaning. So the question is how difficult it is to work always with somebody else's collection.
Somebody else is outside your own collection.
No. The Wallace collection.
Right. So
always. The one view collection.
So you mean that like taking? Oh, I see. Yeah, I think. I mean, you sort of discover it as you go along. I think there's a sense of that you can't have acquired like. Okay, I think I understand your question. That you can't go out and buy things to then put it together. You're given the collection, and you have to deal with what you have. So I think what happens there is that you decide what you study, you try and bring out the very best pictures and give them the more space. But then, you know, you could do exhibitions, and that's one thing we can now do at Wallace, is bring exhibitions and bring the comparable paintings to bring out aspects that perhaps are not so well known about our pictures. So I think isolating them in our exhibition space is a very good way of trying to catch up with what the National Gallery has been able to do.
Would you like to have the Spanish room collection as the National Gallery has, or it's not worth it?
No, I think this is one thing that when I left National Gallery, I felt very liberated to not have to have the Italian, the French, and I think they've tried to break that a bit.
Yes.
So they could do a bit more. But you know, when you walk into the Great Gallery, I like to call it as a sort of anti-Brexit, because it's so about Europe, the beauty of the European school, and how art traveled. You know, we think it's all segregated, but actually artists travel, pictures travel, there was a lot of cultural exchange. So there's a great satisfaction from that, to be able to see a Canaletto in front of a Titian not far from a Velasquez. That's something that National Gallery could do very nicely, to put Titian and Velasquez together. Have you done that? Oh, yeah.
Is there any big piece that you already spoke about that, but I wanted to ask you more. What is the big piece, the big Spanish painting that the National Gallery lost? In your opinion, missed by, and which is the big painting that Richard Wallace could have afforded and didn't buy?
Well, I mean, I think I put it in for a reason. I mean, the one de Pareja says there's tremendous portraits. There's a really,
But that was
story.
unpayable at the time.
Well, I mean, I think they did try quite hard.
They could have done it.
Yeah,
They
did
could
try.
have done it.
It would have had to been through a government grant essentially, but the appeal of the government just wasn't heard essentially. But no, that picture is extraordinarily interesting. As an example of Velázquez's art, his late style, his portraiture. But I mean, as was shown by the really tremendous exhibition in New York at the Met a couple of years ago, it's really a picture that tells us a lot about our own time. Right? It's a portrait of a person of color, an enslaved assistant of Velázquez, who Velázquez does free after some time, but it's a long process in getting there. And so I think thinking about issues like that is one of the reasons that picture, I mean, is really so indispensable. It's an amazing picture for us to have in the collection for that, and for also being able to sort of tell even in more depth the story of Velázquez. But I think for me, having looked through, I mean, do we want a 5-meter tall Carreño? Probably not. But that picture by Velázquez would be amazing. A missed opportunity.
The Pulido de Juan de Pareja and
Mhm.
the Matías del Matthew is a beautiful painting.
It is, and I think
It really is.
yeah, I think that there needs to be a bit more work done on that. It's gone back and forth a couple of times, and I think
It's not clear.
no, it's
And
not clear.
It's not clear. It's not.
I would like to get one more Velázquez if I can, and if I can find it in my collection, even better.
But you can find it on the Wallace. And the Napolitan La Adoración de los Magos, we really need to solve that. It's been too long.
Yes.
I
Well,
was
I
a
know.
kid and people were talking.
Yes, no, well, good. I mean,
It's too long.
there was a wonderful full-scale copy that came up recently in the
Yes.
Spanish collection,
Yes,
but I know that Benito Navarrete has his ideas, so
I know.
we will see. We will see.
We will see. We will see.
And so one picture that we are missing at the Wallace is a Goya, quite simply.
Yes.
And the portrait that he should have bought is the Condesa de Chichon, which would look wonderful in our collection. That's a beautiful portrait, but they would work very well with our Gainsboroughs.
He could have bought the
No, he couldn't. I mean,
Okay. I was
it
back.
was in the private collection.
Okay, it was stuck at the
Yeah,
time.
but he might have had the money to do it, yeah. But it didn't come up on the market, unlike that.
It came up too late.
Yeah.
Too late.
But it is something we are missing is a Goya portrait.
Okay, so I would thank you both. Thank you very much. Are there any questions? Preguntas, question. Are there any
No.
questions? Yes.
No worries.
The dark and dirty monk.
Mhm.
Has it ever been cleaned? There's lots as if it hasn't, and that's why you can't see his face.
No, actually, it was very recently cleaned, actually. Our colleague Larry Keith, who's the head of conservation at the gallery, did a quite extensive piece of work on it, maybe 5 or 6 years ago, because it had this sort of what seemed to be a sort of stone niche around it. And it turns out that much of that was not original. There was some kind of overpaint. And so a decision was taken to sort of suppress some of that and to give it that very dark background to blend in the middle part of it with the sides around, which gave sort of the wrong impression of what the original painting looked like. And so no, I'd say it's sparkling clean, I have to say. But it's apparent though that when you're looking at it closely, that sort of the cast shadow of the hood falling over Francis's face, really it doesn't give you much of a space at all. And I think it's a very sort of intentional thing. It's supposed to aid the viewer in sort of individual contemplation and prayer in sort of quite a dark, probably space. So it would have stood out in a way that a sculpture might have. So yes, that one has been recently cleaned, but there are things I agree that still do need So,
Talking about cleaning. I don't like if you've seen recently the Aguador in the Atelier collection. And need proper cleaning, and need proper lighting. I think it's looks quite isolated there. There, I think it needs to be moved somewhere else. No,
which one's it? The water
The
supply,
water.
perhaps the house.
the water
yes,
cellar,
yes,
the
yeah.
water cellar. There are two versions of that painting, one in the hat, one on the other hat. I wonder if you have a few words about it.
You asked about the disposition of Apsley House, the landscape in the
The
Apsley
way
House.
it's shown.
No, it's, I mean, Apsley House is one of the other great houses that has the collection that was Spanish royal
Yeah.
collection, so on. And the Aguador is the masterpiece, and people forget it's there. And then when they go there, it's unfortunately the way it's lit is because on one wall there's a lot of reflected light, so it's very frustrating. And I mean, I've always dreamt that the National Gallery one day would look after Apsley House and bring things across to Trafalgar Square from time to time, because to see the Aguador at the National Gallery, you know, every once a year, or you know, a bit like other pictures that come and go. It'd be a wonderful way of marketing Apsley House. Go and see the other Spanish pictures, but meanwhile, because it's lost. Yeah, it's a real pity.
Quite
It's-
isolated.
and there's another
quite
great
indoor.
one, yeah, speaking of Quevedo as well, the beautiful portrait of Quevedo, which is stunning. And there's of course the head of Innocent X. But no, it's a surprising collection, but the Aguador is one of the great masterpieces of his early career.
Anybody else?
When you see those signs going like that, it
Yes.
means we need to say bye. So thank you again to la UNED, Universidad en Londres. Gracias, Víctor, Instituto Cervantes. Ha sido un honor estar en este auditorio y que acogieras con los brazos abiertos el acto. Muchísimas gracias. Se nota que eres un historiador del arte. Thank you, Victor, very much. And above all, thank you for my two marvelous Hispanistas present here with long careers. Thank you for your views, your vision, and your care about Velázquez, Zurbarán. Rivera, I think we abandoned him a little, but that's another conferencia. And Greco, gracias a los dos. I'm very proud you accepted. Thank you very much, and thank you to all the público. If people who home don't see it, but it's full. And I know there were so many people online, so thank you very much to everyone.
¿Trabajas con Víctor? Jorge.
Soy en la de comunicaciones.
Oh.
Soy pues,
Ok. Soy un voluntaria con Jorge. Mucho gusto. Sí, Sonia. ¿Cómo se llama? Marta.
que me
So that's-
Ah.